The year is 1991. A turbulent time that would begin the massive shift of culture from its neon-soaked saccharine bliss of the 80s to the edgy and angst-riddled sludge of the 90s. Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirits hits MTV, and the world of rock music is forever changed. From those first few power chords ringing out, the previous decade's landscape of cheery new wave and hairspray-riddled cock rock is all but washed away, as the grunge era begins to hit the mainstream. Dragon Ball is brought to America, being introduced to an at the time niche audience, changing the course of American pop culture forever, as it laid the foundation for one of the biggest and most popular anime to ever exist, to plant the very seeds for an entire medium of entertainment to sprout from beyond the small successes of what came in the West before. And in theaters, a film is released. One that would become so iconic, its influence is still felt 34 years later. Silence of the Lambs. A legendary horror thriller about a young FBI agent following a horrifying case regarding a heinous serial killer who kidnaps and slaughters women, all to build his very own skin suit, forever shifting the landscape of horror. Again, just like Nirvana, washing away much of the 80s more tongue-in-cheek slasher films, with something that's far more grounded, yet far more fantastical. A hunt for a serial killer, using the advice and tutelage of an even more meticulous serial killer. But with this film came more than just an amazing piece of cinema. At the center of this movie was an iconic sequence of its villain, dancing and dressing up, in a scene that has stood the test of time. And it's this very scene where we hear "Goodbye, Horses." Goodbye Horses would not only be the perfect backdrop for this scene, but a song that sprung a life of its own. As the popularity of the movie sprung to life one of the most coveted one-hit wonders of all time. A fantastic piece of dark new wave that would take the world by storm with its otherworldly sound of both beauty and haunting dissonance. Being covered by countless artists, and the song's lifetime remaining heavily relevant and popular consistently nearly 3 decades after its release. Though, it's here where things take a little bit of a turn. Typically when you look at one-hit wonders, their stories all follow a handful of similar paths. Either overnight surprise success, or a long career of trying to hit the big time, swinging out of the park with a hit song, and from there, maintaining a cult-followed career, or failing to really get out there again and falling back into the abyss of obscurity from which they came. You know, it's not really the most exciting thing. It's kind of just one of those little things that you kind of Google search, and, you know, if we rewind back to the land before time, it's where you take a trip to the CD store and, you know, you would find out that these artists are still out there, but just not reaching the success or the acclaim that they did with their initial hit. Q Lazzarus, on the other hand, is a far different story. Only a handful of years after Goodbye Horses had taken the world by storm, Q would disappear. Her presence in music had become nothing, a ghost floating in the distance, unseen by anyone. And as the years would go on and no signs of life would be found, even her own bandmates would begin to believe that she was dead. And it was this here that would end up beginning a mystery of sorts, and one that would be a hot topic of discussion for nearly 2 decades before its resolution. So why don't we talk about the famous tale of the disappearance of Q Lazzarus? So, who was Q Lazzarus? Before the moniker, Q was Diane Lucky, a girl from New Jersey who sang choir for her local church. She was just like anyone else, a face in the crowd who dreamed of one day being a star. And in the late 70s, she would begin to pursue that dream, initially working as a backup singer in Philadelphia's Sigma Sound Studios and creating jingles for commercials. A relatively lucrative and easy way of getting into the industry if you can become successful with it. This is very similar to the story of Mark Foster and Foster the People, where that band was able to get off the ground as Mark Foster made commercial jingles and had access to a studio in order to create the beginnings of his band's career. Another good example is Trent Reznor. While he didn't make commercial jingles, he did work in a studio, at least in a pretty disgusting fashion the way that he would describe, but it was having access to a studio that allowed him to be able to create the demos of what would later become Pretty Hate Machine. Though for Diane, this venture would relatively be short-lived, and by the early 80s, she would relocate, finding a home in the city that never sleeps. Setting up shop in New York, Diane would take a few different trades to get by. The two notable ones would be one as a live-in housekeeper and the other as a taxi driver. It was also around this time that she would begin to don the name Q. In the early 80s, she would start a band with some of the people that she had met around that time. And that band would be named Q Lazzarus and the Resurrection. From what can be found on online articles as well as the wealth of knowledge that is Wikipedia, Q Lazzarus and the Resurrection would be a bit of an Aerosmith-style rock band initially, at least according to Q and some of its members. The group would consist of Gloriana Galacia, Janice Bernstein, but most importantly, William Garvey. William would serve as the main songwriter and composer for the band, and while he and Q were the magic duo that made the Resurrection what they were, he was also a volatile character who had a tumultuous and rough relationship with Q, never really having anything good to say about her, and even into his dying days in the late 2000s, Garvey would rarely mention her outside of the oh-so-famous track, Goodbye Horses. Now, outside of this information, not much is really known about Diane Lucky and her time in New York. Being that she was an at the time nobody, and it was the early 80s, it's not really all that surprising that there's not much here. But the thing is, she wouldn't be a nobody for long, as during the mid-80s, it would happen. Diane would pick up a very special passenger in her taxi.
I think they saw what a hard worker I was. I think they thought that I had a gift for filmmaking. I was bringing these films in on budget, and they were good pictures. And I think that they just felt that we had a relationship going, that the time had come for them to trust me with this new book. Of course, at the time, nobody knew, I didn't know, or the people at Orion didn't know that Silence of the Lambs had the potential for being such a big success.
Jonathan Demme is a director who was known for his experimental style as well as his thriller films. He started his career off in the 70s and for the most part was one of those not unknown but not really household names, being known in the industry as a guy who could make great movies with a lower budget. Some of his more notable films during this period would have been Caged Heat as well as Beloved. Where he comes to play in the story here is that one fateful night in 1985, Demme would hail a taxi, and his driver would be none other than Diane Lucky. She was playing her own demo in the cab at the time, and Demme ended up really liking what he heard. And it was from this chance meeting that the two would end up striking a bit of a friendship. And 3 short years later, the world would be introduced to Q Lazzarus, in Demme's hit film.
In her Jonathan Demme film, Married to the Mob.
That's nice.
Demme would originally feature the song in his 1988 movie, Married to the Mob, though initially the track wouldn't garner a cult following like it did later. As history goes, Demme, who loved the track, would once again feature the song in the next film he worked on, Silence of the Lambs. And thanks to the masterful filmmaking and storytelling, it would really carry the song, as it played during the now iconic scene of Buffalo Bill dancing while putting on makeup, backdropping a scene remembered to this day for just how over-the-top yet frightening the entire thing was. A killer playfully dancing in their delusion as their victim struggles to escape the hole that he's trapped her in, waiting for the right time to cut her up and steal her skin. This wasn't originally the track that was even meant for this scene, funny enough. Originally, it was chosen to be set to Bob Seger's track, Your Slut. But during the filming, Goodbye Horses would end up being chosen as it just fit the scene perfectly, and I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. Goodbye Horses is a haunting piece, sounding both new yet old, with its synth work sounding fresh for the time, but the overall production having this much older cassette quality to it. And it just made the whole thing feel as if it was a piece of music that has always existed. Q's dreamy yet androgynous voice floating over the top with cryptic lyrics just made it all the more otherworldly. And as it served as the backdrop to such an iconic scene in an already masterful film, it was almost destined to be a hit, even if it took 3 years to reach that status. The song would also get a lo-fi music video playing on the ghostly qualities of the music itself, as the black and white low quality of it makes it yet again feel ancient. Though this is more than likely because this was done probably on a low budget, given that this predates even its first appearance in Married to the Mob. The video depicts Q herself singing as various footage of runes surrounding a toy horse are splayed around, men dancing with apparitions around them, and other strange imagery are all shown. And while there isn't really necessarily anything scary or grotesque depicted, the whole video just feels haunted, as if it's something that hexes you after watching it, like the video from The Ring. So, in essence, it fits perfectly with the song that it was made for. Demme would go on to feature Q yet again in his 1993 drama film Philadelphia, where Q herself would make an in-person cameo, singing the Talking Heads song Heaven, marking her third appearance in a Hollywood film. But as popular as Goodbye Horses had become, well, this scene in the video for Goodbye Horses would really be some of the only footage that we have of Q, as she was a rather elusive figure before, and going forward, not much would change. And that really kind of begs the question. With all the movie appearances and the popularity of the song, shouldn't that mean that Q Lazzarus' career should be taking off by now? After Goodbye Horses would become a smash hit in 1991, you would really think that Q Lazzarus would be able to capitalize off of it and go on to have a lucrative, or at least a lucrative enough career. But that's the thing. This is where all the normalcies of the story, which have already been very few, mind you, fall apart. Even though she had had a hit song in one of the most popular and important horror films to ever release, and even having a cameo in the film Philadelphia, due to restrictive and, well, there's no other way of saying this, racist conduct of the record industry, Q would never be able to secure a record deal. She was turned down constantly when she would approach any record company, And due to her wanting to make rock music over the synth-pop style that she was famous for, she would constantly be turned down as record companies deemed her unmarketable. In a dazed interview, former bandmate and friend Gloriana Galacia would recall this being the case back in the 80s. Q encountered blocks with cheesy, pop-infested mid-1980s record companies, says Galacia. Q wore dreads then, and they kept telling her, "We cannot market you." She replied, "I market myself. I'm a big-boned African-American woman who wears dreads, sings American rock and roll. I market myself." Even with the success of Goodbye Horses and the eyes that she had on her, it would still be unlikely and a bit of an Olympian task for Q to secure a record contract, as this was the mid-80s and the early 90s when she was looking respectively. And during this period, 90s gangster rap was the new big thing that record labels wanted black artists to push. And outside of that would be, well, it'd be really rare to see a black artist get a chance, with the only other genres they would really get any sort of leeway in would be R&B or soul, or really anything else that would be considered quote-unquote black music at the time. Of course, you did have some exceptions to that rule, but that was typically within more niche and underground genres like hardcore punk or metal. The over-controlling and unwilling nature of record executives is something that even the great late Frank Zappa would regularly criticize.
Remember the 60s, that era that a lot of people, have these glorious memories of, which they really weren't that great those years. But one thing that did happen during the 60s was some music of an unusual or experimental nature did get recorded and did get released. Now look at who the executives were in those companies at those times. Not hip young guys. These were cigar-chomping old guys who looked at the product that came and said, "I don't know. Who knows what it is? Record it, stick it out. If it sells, all right." We were better off with those guys than we are now with the supposedly hip young executives, who are making the decisions of what people should see and hear in the marketplace.
Alright, now, if the length of this video and the relatively sparse amount of information hasn't given it away yet, Q, or Diane Lucky, was someone who held a tight grip on their privacy before fame had ever had a chance to catch her. And with her relatively reclusive nature, this is where we enter the point where most of the information we have is purely speculation. One of the big ones being that she had apparently moved over to the United Kingdom in the late 80s to start up a band there, but as with her ventures in America, it mounted little to no success. And after 18 years of trying to break out, even after being given an opportunity of the lifetime with Goodbye Horses, having that opportunity squandered by record executives and the constant dead ends would just lead to silence. Even aside from comments by one of her ex-bandmates and some guy in a forum claiming to be her ex-boyfriend that managed the UK version of the Resurrection, we really have no concrete leads or proof that she was even in the UK at all, or maybe if she lived there for a few years and came back to America, or if she just never left the US at all and it was all just people making claims. Because in reality, by 1996, all signs of life would go dark. Q Lazzarus had on all accounts disappeared. Galacia fears that Q is dead and alleges that she was involved in a toxic, abusive relationship with a controlling man. "We feared he isolated or perhaps abused her," says Galacia. "Cutting someone's friends off is abusive." This comes from the same interview with Galacia mentioned earlier, Q's previous bandmate, the same one who gave the information that Q had moved to the UK to begin with. And the thing is whether this was true or not is really up for debate, as Galicia is just a third party, and one that is already speaking out of pure speculation. The only real truth we have is that after 1996, Q would completely vanish from the public eye, no longer appearing in any films or releasing any new music. And while at first, really no one batted an eye, as Q wasn't really the most famous artist who ever lived, and the films that brought her fame were at this point yesterday's news, as the silence would continue and the years would roll on, more and more fans would begin to notice her absence. And among them would be her former bandmates, with multiple of them believing that there was a possibility that Q was dead. And as the years went on, things would only escalate as interest grew, and more wild rumors would begin to bubble up to the surface. This would all come to a head in 2016 when things would finally ramp up to another level. And that was when a Reddit post to r/unsolved mysteries would bring up the situation, and it would begin to make the rounds.
Hello, this is my first post here. I'm hoping that because this isn't so much a conventional murder type mystery that it's loud. I think I'm following the post guidelines correctly. I'm so sorry if the formatting isn't easy to follow, and will likely edit it after posting. This is a personal favorite mystery of mine. I love the song Goodbye Horses sung by Q Lazzarus. You likely remember it as the Buffalo Bill song. Anyways, I was recently delving deeper into the singer's history and have come up short, with virtually no new information on her past 1996, called one of the biggest mysteries of modern Hollywood. Let's look at the information we have.
The OP would post a link to the Wikipedia page, as well as some additional information and articles, most of which we've already spoken about in this video. This would spark a huge reaction from the community, who would begin to flood into the thread to speak about their own theories and what they thought happened to Q. This would even culminate with the massive true crime YouTuber Lazy Masquerade including this very post in one of their Mystery Unsolved videos.
Her ex-manager last saw her looking unwell. She became close to a Swedish hustler and cokehead who apparently cut her off from the rest of the world and filtered everyone away from her. Her songwriter, William Garvey, said that he was certain she was dead. Garvey himself died in 2009. Perhaps most odd is that she has unclaimed royalties just waiting to be collected. Seeing how her music is featured in some prominent movies, this could be a significant amount of money. Why wouldn't she have claimed it by now? Even her old bandmate, Gloriana Galicia, says that she doesn't know whether Q is alive or dead.
And that right there is one of the biggest sticking points of this entire situation. One of the biggest reasons why it was believable that Q is either dead or a missing person somewhere was her unpaid royalties, never collected and never taken. Given the large amount of cash that would probably have amounted to by that point, and all three of her previous bandmates assuming that she was dead, it really made the mystery ring much louder in the true crime circles than other music mysteries typically do. There was enough circumstantial evidence to really make it seem as if Q Lazzarus was actually dead, leaving this world at some point after she fell off the face of the earth in the mid-90s. And with bandmates like Galicia making claims about an abusive boyfriend, and the usual theories of drug addiction playing a role in her behavior and possibly being the cause of her death, without Q or anyone who knew her to really pop up, there would be no one to provide any concrete information to counter these rumors and these claims. These theories would just continue to fester and become more wild as the years went on. And for many, they would be the answers to the mystery. And for the foreseeable future, no new information would bubble up.
I like to think that she just left show business and is living a quiet life under a different name, but having unclaimed money is a little ominous. That wiki article about her definitely reads like it was written by someone very close to her, or more likely herself. You see it on IMDb sometimes with the lower level actors. Not a knock on their career abilities, I just mean someone who is not a star performer and perhaps doesn't have representation. Honestly, I think this is the most obvious answer based off her Wikipedia page. It would appear that she was involved in a certain NYC art scene, and it's likely that with her waning notoriety, she just faded back into obscurity. Now, this is possibly the only thing we could get a sinister conclusion theory from. Interesting stuff. I wonder how much there is to claim. I'm adding this and other new info to the main post. This is depressingly common in the entertainment industry, I'm afraid. I myself went through this with Q a few years ago when I read a rumor of a full album of hers floating around somewhere. But yeah, she's definitely not the only case, especially once you veer into the more experimental music. Not uncommon for a musician to disappear for 10 or more years, and for even their closest contacts to just shrug.
You've got mail.
In 2018, an article from Stereo Gum would go up, and it would give an update on the Q Lazzarus mystery. This time being, a resolution. The writer would tweet about yet again looking to see if anyone had heard from Q Lazzarus, and this time, they would get a response from what he assumed was a troll claiming to be Q. But instead, what he was met with was the real thing. In a both bizarre and very realistic turn of events, it turned out Q was not only alive, but had never truly gone missing in the first place. It's just that nobody looked for her to begin with in the right places. Q, or real name Diane Lucky, had just gone silent during the mid-90s after giving up on music and went back to a normal work life, getting a job as a bus driver in Staten Island.
Hi, sorry to bother you. I just wanted people to know that I'm still alive. I have no interest in singing anymore. I'm a bus driver in Staten Island. I have been for years. I see hundreds of passengers every day, so I'm hardly hiding or dead. I've given Thomas Gorton my phone number and address just to confirm that I'm real. Sorry if this is a boring end to the story. I'm going to come off Twitter soon as I find it odd. Please take note of this message in case anyone else is interested. Thank you. Now, the bus driver part made sense to me because she was a cab driver when she was discovered. A logical step in the next direction, right? I still wasn't entirely convinced, but the woman posted a selfie before deleting the account, of which I have a screenshot, and it is indeed a woman resembling the rather mysterious looking and notably rare promo shots of Q from the late 80s. I decided to Google Diane Lucky, as that was the name of the woman used as her Twitter display name. And as it fucking turns out, there is a woman named Diane Lucky who filed a lawsuit against a Staten Island bus company back in 2015 for not having a single woman driver. This was not widely reported on, as lawsuits are totally common and boring, but I found the info on a few smaller Jewish news sites, as the bus company was Hasidic owned. So for this woman to have faked this all, she would have had to find a selfie of a woman closely resembling a mysterious one-hit wonder from the late 80s who has aged 30 years, found an obscure woman's name who happens to drive buses in Staten Island, and is only searchable by a minor lawsuit that happened in 2015. pretended to be that woman, made a Twitter account for exactly 1 day, keyword searched herself, and responded to 3 or 4 people trying to contact anyone who was interested and thought she was dead. Then deleted the account to maintain anonymity while also wanting people to know she's very much alive. Her whole impetus for doing so seems to be over upset with this Dazed article where it is presumed that she is dead. I'll post screenshots of the conversation in the comments below, but I'm basically 100% sure the person who contacted me is in fact Q Lazzarus, and it's blowing my fucking mind. Goodbye Horses continues to be one of my favorite songs of all time, and if this is all true, I'm so happy to know someone I admire so much is living a happy, simple life away from the lechery of the music industry by choice. The song is haunting and iconic, and it's the perfect happy ending to all the horrible rumors that she died in London in the 90s, or befriended a drug addict who abused her, or got wrapped up in a bad marriage, or any of the other conspiracies I heard.
So after all these years, the truth was finally out there in the open. People were just looking in the wrong places, searching for an elusive artist who abandoned their moniker decades ago and overlooking the most obvious place to find her, their old stomping grounds in a profession close to the one that she worked in before ever landing that big break. This Stereo Gum article is absolutely wild, and I highly recommend you read it for yourself. The entire mystery and intrigue of the disappearance of Q Lazzarus is one that might be a little anticlimactic to some, but to me it's just absolutely insane of a story. Sure, it doesn't have some morbid ending to it. Q wasn't some tragic character pulled away into the pits of abuse by some horrible lover somewhere, or a rising star who had just fallen on hard times and succumbed to addiction, but rather she was actually just a normal person who went back to being a normal person. And I actually think the resolution fits here perfectly. Q Lazzarus was a ghost before Goodbye Horses, and had just returned back to the shadows after it was over, simply choosing to keep her privacy rather than live her life as a one-hit wonder chasing that dragon of fame for the rest of her life, which is something that is all too common in the music industry. Instead, she would go back to being Diane Lucky and enjoyed the ride, and once it was over, just returned to live a normal life. Though tragically, this would be a short-lived resolution, as only 4 short years after the Stereo Gum piece was put out and 6 years after the initial mystery hit the mainstream of the internet, in 2022, Q, or Diane Lucky, would pass away due to illness, permanently closing the book on her story. The life of an unlikely artist, striking it big, only to return to the darkness and become famous once again for the mystery and legacy that they left behind. For all the entertainment and the intrigue that this mystery gave us, the handful of songs that honestly have had a bigger impact than many artists' entire discographies have had, thank you, Diane. And I hope you rest in peace, Q Lazzarus. Now, before we go, these are my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters. Typically, I'd have some backhanded sarcastic thing to say here, but given the seriousness of this video, out of respect for Q and her passing, I will reluctantly just say, if you like what you see, my Patreon and Ko-fi are in the description. And for those of you that support me, I can't thank you enough. It means a lot. And it makes doing these sort of experimental videos like this one, actually something I can do. So once again, thank you all for all of your support, and I hope you enjoyed the content. This was a bit of a different video for me, but I had a lot of fun making it and researching it, and Goodbye Horses is just a classic. I had to tell this story. There's no way I couldn't do it. I've been wanting to do this for a while now, so I'm glad I was able to. But with that, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.